Eyes look into the well, tears ran down from the eye. The tower cracked and fell from the quiet winter sky. Under a midnight stone, love lies buried by thieves. The robbed heart begs for a bone. The damned rustle like leaves. Face down in the flooded brook, with nothing left to say, lies one the soldiers took and spoiled and threw away.
W.H. Auden didn't become Poet Laureate or win the Nobel Prize, but of all modern English poets, he is the one who tells us most about our unstable contemporary world. The period through which he lived seems eerily similar to our own, and 44 years after he died in a small village outside Vienna, his poetry feels uncannily prophetic in our own anxious times.
Perfection of a kind was what he was after, and the poetry invented was easy to understand. He knew human folly like the back of his hand, was greatly interested in armies and fleets. When he laughed, respectable senators burst with laughter. And when he cried, the little children died in the streets.
Auden's full of what would have been in the air politically, nationally at that time. I suppose every age has a sort of mood, doesn't it? And we're in a paranoid time now, aren't we? Unidentified danger, that's something very current. It is incoherent, and he's in an incoherent moment, and that's what you get, and maybe that's why it speaks now.
I was all about tolerance, I was all about commonality, and that was all ruptured by the infusion of venom when that plane brought its poison through the skin of the World Trade Center. And I think Auden in 1939 was sensitive to the same poison that was in the body politic. We're still dealing with that poison that was infused into the system.
Looking at life from a very great height, the bird's eye view, was something that he learned as a very young poet. But by using this, he helps us all to get the sense of a personal experience that is human, but which is in context. And that makes it more comprehensible.
The great poet is a product of his or her moment. And if they're true to their moment, given the way things are in the world, they will be true to all moments.
I'm on my way back to the village of Kestetten in southern Austria, where Auden was buried in 1973. It's been 35 years since I made a film about him for the BBC in 1982, and filmed the cottage here where he spent his summers. Auden was the most important English poet of the 1930s, but he left England in 1939 to live in New York, where he eventually became an American citizen. Unlike many other writers, his reputation has increased with time, and his poems seem to speak to us as clearly today as when they were written half a century ago.
What one secretly hopes from a reader is on reading, they'll say, my God, I knew that all the time, but I never realized it before. That's what is the ideal reaction. Because then you know you said something that's true.
I believe that reading the work of W.H. Auden may make a difference to one's life. Of course, we can be changed by reading or listening to something that moves us deeply, that makes us see ourselves or the world in a different light. It may be a poem that has this effect, or it may be the contemplation of a great painting. The work of art we're confronted with unlocks within us the recognition of something that has escaped us before. We are changed because we now understand something that we did not understand before.
Oh, what is that sound so thrills the ear? Down in the valley, drumming, drumming. Only the scarlet soldiers, dear, the soldiers coming. Oh, what are they doing with all that gear? What are they doing this morning, this morning? Only their usual maneuvers, dear, or perhaps a warning.
I remember the precise circumstances in which I discovered the works of Auden. I was lecturing at Queen's University in Belfast, and the Troubles were in full swing. One heard bombs going off, there was gunfire, really a low-scale civil war was going on. And so in those circumstances, reading Auden, it just seemed to me that he was talking directly about things that actually were occurring right then.
Oh, it's broken the lock and splintered the door. Oh, it's the gate where they're turning, turning. Their boots are heavy on the floor, and their eyes are burning.
I think that Auden continues to be relevant in difficult times. He teaches us to listen to other people. He teaches us to sympathize.
Auden's craggy features are the most instantly recognisable of all 20th century writers. He understood the power of the camera and was photographed from a very early age, often by well-known photographers, including Cecil Beaton. He was comfortable with media of any kind, and his fame extended well beyond the English-speaking world. By the 1960s, his work was widely translated, and he was internationally famous. In 1967, a team from Austrian television went to Kestetten to film Auden on the occasion of his 60th birthday.
Entschuldigen Sie bitte, wo wohnt denn hier Herr Auden?
Ja, der Auden, unser Dichter. Da fahren Sie da geradeaus und dann links vom großen Wegweiser vorüber und dann nur mal links hinauf durch das Autobahnviadukt und gleich neben dem Wald ist die Villa. Übrigens, die Wegweiser sind von mir.
Auden had lived for a time in Berlin, and he spoke fluent German.
Mr. Auden, ich vermute...
Jawohl.
Stehen Sie immer so früh auf?
Wollen wir weiter? Ja. Bitte kommen Sie weiter.
Auden shared the cottage with his partner, the American poet Chester Coleman, who was 14 years younger.
Darf ich vorstellen, mein Kollege, Herr Chester Coleman. Bitte, nehmen Sie Platz.
Danke. Darf ich fragen, sind Sie Engländer oder Amerikaner?
Ich bin in England geboren, aber seit 1945 bin ich Amerikaner.
Sie sind geborener Amerikaner, Mr. Coleman?
Ja, geboren.
In New York geboren?
In Brooklyn, New York.
Chester Coleman was just 18 when he and Auden met in 1939. Chester was serially unfaithful, but Auden regarded their relationship as a marriage, and they lived together in a run-down apartment in the East Village in New York.
Did you feel an American?
I wouldn't say I feel American. I can call myself a New Yorker, which is a rather special brand of character. I think of myself as a New Yorker.
When he came to America, he quite soon met Chester, and that made a difference, a big difference, because he felt this is the love of my life, and he was very upfront about his sexual preferences. And there's an account of him being interviewed for a college job where he just tells them upfront, I like boys, and they better be clear about this.
Did you get the job?
He got the job, yes, absolutely.
Auden was equally honest about his own feelings, and he wrote frequently about the perils and pleasures of being human. His poems are highly personal, but also universal in what they have to tell us about love.
Some say that love's a little boy, and some say he's a bird. Some say he makes the world go round, and some say that's absurd. But when I asked the man next door, who looked as if he knew, his wife was very cross indeed and said it wouldn't do. Does it look like a pair of pyjamas, or the ham in a temperance hotel? Does its odour remind one of llamas, or has it a comforting smell? Is it prickly to touch as a hedge is, or soft as eider-down fluff? Is it sharp or quite smooth at the edges? Oh, tell me the truth about love. When it comes, will it come without warning, just as I'm picking my nose? Will it knock on my door in the morning, or tread in the bus on my toes? Will it come like a change in the weather? Will its greeting be courteous or bluff? Will it alter my life altogether? Oh, tell me the truth about love.
Do you think it's possible to write a happy love poem? Most of the best ones are so extremely gloomy.
Well, I think you can write happy ones if you, about love which is not too serious, you know. I think there are plenty of them, you know, sort of gather your rosebuds while you may fall in love, that kind of thing you can do. Love is always a difficult subject because it's a subject in which probably we deceive ourselves more than in any other field.
What shocked me, I think, when I read about Auden was that he'd written so much about love when he was a young man and been a guru, as it were, somebody that his contemporaries consulted and took advice from. And yet it transpired that he hadn't been in love himself properly until he got to America, when he met Chester Kalman. And when he met Chester Kalman, he then very quickly became aware of all the things he'd been laying down the law about, like jealousy and so on, and life had caught up with him.
Looking up at the stars, I know quite well that for all they care, I can go to hell. But on earth, indifference is the least we have to dread from man or beast. How should we like it, were stars to burn, with a passion for us we could not return? If equal affection cannot be, let the more loving one be me. Now those two final lines there, if equal affection cannot be, then let the more loving one be me. You can analyse those lines in lots of ways, and one way certainly is to see it as Auden talking about his own relationship with Chester Kalman. And I think that there was inequality in the sense that Auden wanted more out of that than Chester was prepared to give.
Auden's intellect was formidable and showy and quite off-putting. As an undergraduate at Oxford in 1956, I happened to hear his inaugural lecture as Professor of Poetry. Had I any ambitions to write at that time, the lecture would have been enough to put me off. Auden listed all the interests and accomplishments that poets and critics should properly have. A dream of Eden, an ideal landscape, even, God help us, a passion for the Icelandic sagas. If writing meant passing this type of kit inspection, one might as well forget it. I never actually met him, I just heard him talk. I was dining in hall at Exeter College, and I could hear this voice, this harsh, quacking voice, and I said to my neighbour, that sounds like the voice of the devil. And he said, no, it's W.H. Auden.
One of the elements in poetry, of course it's not the only one, is the riddle, that you don't call a spade. Now, it's evident people enjoy solving riddles, because otherwise crossword puzzles wouldn't have popularity as they do. It's funny that some of the people who spend hours doing crossword puzzles, and love doing them, who are the first to raise objections if they don't understand a line of poetry. Now why?
Auden was a student at Oxford in the 1920s, when he was at the centre of a group of writers that included Stephen Spender and Christopher Isherwood, of whom he was the undoubted leader. In 1982, I asked Christopher Isherwood why this was so.
He did represent a combination of qualities, which was, as they say, modern at that time. And of course, the woods are full of people who, at any given moment, are potentially modern in whatever the new manner is. But there's just one little detail. You also have to have enormous talent. And out of all these people, there are very few who do.
Look, stranger, at this island now, the leaping light for your delight discovers. Stance table here, and silent be, that through the channels of the ear may wander like a river the swaying sound of the sea. Here at the small field's ending pause, where the chalk wall falls to the foam and its tall ledges oppose the pluck and knock of the tide. Far off, like floating seeds, the ships diverge on urgent voluntary errands, and a full view indeed may enter and move in memory as now these clouds do, that pass the harbour mirror, and all the summer through the water saunter. Diverge on urgent voluntary errands is very much Auden, really. It's an image of the 30s like you got on railway posters in a way. And I think he was aware that he was the laureate, as it were, of that sort of period. And one of the reasons why he was glad to be out of England, he didn't want to go on being that.
This is the night mail crossing the border, bringing the check and the postal order, letters for the rich, letters for the poor, the shop at the corner and the girl next door, pulling up beat took a steady climb, the gradients against her, but she's on time.
In many ways, Auden is our first truly modern poet. He wrote about factories and lead mines, appeared on the radio, and even joined the newly formed GPO film unit, where he wrote a poem to accompany a documentary that was set to music by his friend Benjamin Britten.
Wind-bent grasses, birds turn their heads as she approaches, stare from the bushes at her blank-faced coaches. Sheepdogs cannot turn her course, they slumber on with paws across. In the farm she passes, no one wakes, but a jug in a bedroom gently shakes.
It's just after 4 when Whiston steps off the train at Helensburgh Station. As the steam clears, he looks out for his friend Cecil, who got him the job at Larchfield and is the entire reason he's here. Leaning against one of the platform's wrought iron pillars is a boy of 16 or so, smoking. From his experience of loitering rent boys looking for trade, Whiston knows the boy is not waiting for anyone in particular. Their eyes meet. The boy stares, drawing deeply on the stub of a cigarette, as if it is his last. When Whiston looks back, the boy is still staring.
After Oxford, Auden got a job as a teacher at a prep school on the west coast of Scotland.
Auden came to Helensburgh in 1930 because he had been offered the job as a teacher at Larchfield School on the recommendation of Cecil Day-Lewis, who also taught at Larchfield, but he cracked after a year and recommended Auden for the job. So I think he got the job even without interview. He just turned up. There was only about 50 children, and Auden himself was a very eccentric teacher.
When poet Polly Clark moved to Helensburgh, she was surprised to discover that Auden had lived there for 2 years in the 1930s.
I was initially disappointed that the poet who'd been here was Auden. I didn't understand how a gay man of 24 in 1930 could speak to me. You don't like to think a young person has something to tell you.
Her novel, Larchfield, looks at Auden at this little-known but crucial moment when he was forging his own voice as a poet.
He published his first book of poems while he was here. He wrote The Orators while he was here, which was like a blast at me when I first picked it up. And it's a book length. Well, what is it? It's not a poem as such, although T.S. Eliot published it on the poetry list. It's impossible to categorise, really. But his visionary nature is fully formed at 24 in Helensburgh. Establishment of a torpedo base at the head of the loch. A depot for tractors with sliding doors. Visit to a tannery in the hill village where the stream runs under the houses. To the mine with obsolete machinery, an undershot wheel, steam pipes in the open swaddled in sacking. theories interrelating the system of feudal tenure with metabolic gradients, and arguments from the other side of the lake on the formation of hanging valleys, interrupted by the daughter of the house with a broken doll. The language is so exhilarating, there's not a boring word in it. Even if you don't understand what he's saying, it's absolutely exhilarating, all of it.
Auden later said that the orators read as if it was written by someone who would either become a Nazi or go mad.
Helensburgh was, and possibly still is, a conservative sort of town. When it all got too much, he would go to Berlin. The first time he goes with Christopher Isherwood, who's living there by then, and they have a wonderful time.
Berlin in the 1930s was the most decadent city in Europe, and Auden and Isherwood, who was also gay, were able to indulge in a sexual freedom that would have been unthinkable in England, let alone in Helensburgh.
He does go when you've still got the gay bars and the whole life there in Berlin. And then he goes again just before Hitler comes to power, when everything has changed. And he doesn't go back to Berlin after that. So the time in Helensburgh spans this kind of critical moment in Europe.
It's farewell to the drawing room's civilised cry, the professor's sensible where to and why, the frock-coated diplomat's social aplomb. Now matters are settled with gas and with bomb. The works for two pianos, the brilliant stories of reasonable giants and remarkable fairies, the pictures, the ornaments, the frangible wares, and the branches of olives are stored upstairs. For the devil has broken parole and arisen. He has dynamited his way out of prison, out of the well where his papa throws the rebel angel, the outcast rose. Like influenza he walks abroad. He stands by the bridge, he waits by the ford. As a goose or a gull he flies overhead. He hides in the cupboard and under the bed. It's apprehensive, isn't it? Something is going to happen. But there are other prophetic lines. A line about a lone plane approaching a city, which nowadays suggests 9/11.
He had this ability to synthesize vast swathes of historical information and combine them with the minute detail that we would associate maybe with the novelist. So when we want to get something that helps us in these big epic tragedies that are happening now, there is always the big picture and the thing we can relate to. Say this city has 10 million souls. Some are living in mansions, some are living in holes. And then you'll quickly get to there's no place for you and me.
Refugee blues. Say this city has 10 million souls. Some are living in mansions, some are living in holes. Yet there's no place for us, my dear. Yet there's no place for us. Once we had a country and we thought it fair. Look in the atlas and you'll find it there. We cannot go there now, my dear. We cannot go there now. Saw a poodle in a jacket fastened with a pin. Saw a door opened and a cat let in. But they weren't German Jews, my dear. But they weren't German Jews. It was written in March 1939. You know, I think Auden was very conscious of the fragility of what we think of as civilization, what a delicate construct our society is. And I think that's one of the things that comes across from so many of his poems. He doesn't belabor it, but there's a sense of history.
In June 1936, Auden got married. His wife was Erika Mann, the daughter of the great German novelist Thomas Mann, and an ardent opponent of the Nazi regime, which had confiscated her passport.
That marriage was like an act of political collaboration. If you read about that in the press, you might think it was a real marriage. If you knew anything about him, you knew he married her because she needed a passport so she could get out of Germany. They didn't even recognize each other when they got off the train in Ledbury to get married.
Auden at that time was teaching at the Downs, I believe, a smaller public school. And Erika got out one station earlier, too early. And she had never seen Weston. And there was a young man, obviously waiting there alone at the station. And she walked up to him and asked him, "Are you my husband?" "Not at all," he answered with indignation. And then she found out that they must continue one station more. And there the true and real Auden was waiting for her. That was their first meeting.
Auden and Erika Mann never lived together, but they remained friends. And when Erika died in 1969, she left Auden a small legacy in her will.
Funeral blues. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone, silence the pianos, and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin, let the mourners come. The stars are not wanted now, put out every one. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun, pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood, for nothing now can ever come to any good. He's just so good at building from particulars to the big cosmic stuff. So by the time you get to the last stanza, you've got stars, moon, and sun. That's like beyond the planet Earth. It's the whole cosmos. You know, that poem became very important in the movie, 4 Weddings and a Funeral, because attitudes towards what you could present about gay love had changed.
He was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong.
Stars are not wanted now, put out every one. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood. For nothing now can ever come to any good. It's constructionally perfect, isn't it? I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary. Working week, Sunday. He was my north, my south, my east and west. My working week and my Sunday rest. The film was originally going to be called 4 Weddings and a Honeymoon, and then my friend Helen Fielding told me to make it more deep. So I put in the funeral, and then I thought I really want to make it wonderful and serious and profound. So I remembered this poem, which I knew, studied Auden at university, and not only is it completely comprehensible and completely beautiful, but it is a love poem, a man-to-man poem. So it was, perfect. And it's still interesting to me that when people talk about 4 Weddings, this is their favourite bit. It was a very extraordinary day, probably the most memorable day of shooting of my film career, because we picked this very extraordinary location with a sort of classic church in this strange, modern, industrial landscape, which actually fits your sense of Auden in a way. And what was amazing about the day was that the poem's power lasted all day. And from beginning to end, people really cried as a reaction. The poem seemed to get better on its 12th reading.
Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, Prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. Silence the pianos and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin. Let the mourners come.
You can completely understand why people loved this poem when they heard it in the movie, but I also think the setting and the timing of it during the AIDS crisis, we were in, a really dark time. There was a need for a kind of public funeral for two men, and there it was among loving friends in a romantic love story. So I think it just went deep and wide in the whole culture.
When we offered the part to Simon McCall, they said it was the first film he'd read about a gay man dying, but not of AIDS, for 10 years. He just had a heart attack. And I think that was another great thing about using a sort of pre-AIDS poem, that it was about permanent, long tragedy of early death rather than about the current crisis.
People look into Auden and find something new to respond to. And Faber put out a little booklet that was aimed at supermarket counters and so on. And Auden would have reached a much larger audience suddenly than most times in his life.
The booklet sold an astounding 350,000 copies and broke publishing records for a book of English poetry. Auden and Isherwood grew up in the shadow of the First World War and were obsessed with conflict of all kinds. In 1936, they travelled to China to witness the war that was raging there with Japan. As a poet, Auden was determined to experience the unheroic reality of warfare and to write about it honestly at first hand.
This is a sonnet from In Time of War, written in China. Here war is harmless, like a monument. A telephone is talking to a man. Flags on a map declare that troops were sent. A boy brings milk in bowls. There is a plan for living men in terror of their lives, who thirst at 9, who were to thirst at noon, who can be lost and are, who miss their wives and, unlike an idea, can die too soon. Yet ideas can be true, although men die, for we have seen a myriad faces ecstatic from one lie, and maps can really point to places where life is evil now. Nanking, Dachau. That line, for we have seen a myriad faces ecstatic from one lie, that is Auden's evocation of Nazi rallies. And this is one of the things that affected Auden very much, was his feeling for the way fascism manipulated crowds. And he felt that in his own writing, potentially he had a similar ability to wow an audience with something that's untrue. And he very much resisted that. And in later life, his style of reading of his own poetry was very matter-of-fact. It often disappointed people when they heard him read for the first time.
About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky. had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on.
The boy's like tiny, and there's this little splash and the delicate ship sailing calmly on. Auden's observing that these little tragedies that happen to the minor characters, nobody notices. They go on about their business. Icarus flies too high. He falls into the sea. I think there's an anxiety there in Auden's mind. What's going to happen to me when I fly to America, when I cross this ocean?
Auden and Ishwood had returned from China via America and were so captivated by it that they both decided to go and live there. In January 1939, they arrived in New York. As public figures, their departure when war was looming in Europe caused some outrage, and questions were even asked in Parliament.
There's been a tremendous amount of criticism which continues to this day of your decision. Impertinent criticism, I would agree with you, but
people have every right to make
But
it.
in a way, a criticism that you might care to answer.
No, I won't answer that kind of thing. I mean, I know that it was right for me to do, and in fact, I only felt that I discovered who I was after I got to America.
Have you ever had any regrets?
None.
I don't think he cared what people thought.
Oh no, I think he cared. I think he got hurt. When he becomes Oxford Professor of Poetry, he absolutely dreads giving the first lecture because he thinks there will be all these people in the audience hating him, despising him.
Auden was living in New York in September 1939 when he heard that Germany had invaded Poland and the Second World War had begun.
September 1st, 1939. I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odour of death offends the September night. Accurate scholarship can unearth the whole offence from Luther until now that has driven a culture mad. I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. That was the couplet on which people thought, yes, that is true. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return.
I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid. As the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade, waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. For those of us who live downtown, the unmentionable odor that offends the September night was a reality all through September and into October and November.
Todd Stone is the unofficial artist-in-residence at Ground Zero in New York. He has made it his personal project to record the attack on the World Trade Center on September the 11th, 2001, and to document the regeneration of the site.
I live in the neighborhood. I witnessed the attack. I was painting and drawing, which is my practice, through the 11th of September, and was dealing with the grief and horror of watching those 3,000 people murdered. I've been bearing that burden for the rest of my life. I may have studied this poem in college. I don't remember. But I do remember this poem from when it was published in I think it was the New York Times in the weeks that followed the attack.
Auden's poem was published on the editorial pages of 4 major American newspapers in the aftermath of the attack, and it became the iconic poem of 9/11.
into this neutral air where blind skyscrapers use their full height to proclaim the strength of collective man. Each language pours its vain competitive excuse. But who can live for long in an euphoric dream? Out of the mirrors they stare, imperialism's face, and the international wrong. It resonates because the strength of collective man, the lie of authority, this idea that you could have all these gigantic skyscrapers, you could be the big United States, and you could have it all wrong. Did we somehow cause this ourselves? And are we just wildly egotistical to think that we can have everything we want and treat the rest of the world however we like?
Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies. Yet, dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages.
May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. So, these ironic points of light, these are the just, people who behave honorably. His hope is that he will be that kind of person.
At the end of the war, having been rejected from the U.S. Army for being a homosexual, he did get into a uniform on the Strategic Bombing Survey, which was a U.S. government program to go to Germany and find out exactly what had happened when they dropped all these bombs. And it was horrifying. And he wrote home that he would burst into tears. And then I think the impact shows up in that big poem he wrote, The Age of Anxiety, where his sorrow and his horror just emerge in, sort of hints and clues.
Ihr bekanntestes Werk, das groß angelegte dramatische Gedicht, das Zeitalter der Angst, hat einer ganzen Epoche den Namen gegeben.
Ja, das war ein Zufall. Man kann nur sagen, dass natürlich der Hintergrund für dieses Werk ist der Zweite Weltkrieg.
The Age of Anxiety struck a chord with a society that was overshadowed by the fear of a nuclear war between East and West. The poem takes the form of a conversation between four characters who meet one night in a New York bar. In 1948, it won Auden a Pulitzer Prize, and the great American composer Leonard Bernstein based his Second Symphony on it.
These four characters get to know one another, and when the bar closes, they are invited by the girl to come up to her apartment for a nightcap, so they party up there. At least one of the characters does find the core of faith, which is what I'm after in, I guess, every work I ever write.
Bernstein was in some ways a little bit like Auden in that he was a gifted intellectual. He was gay, but he married, he had children, so he had the complicated sexuality. So he identified so much with that poem.
Auden bought the cottage in Castetten with money from an Italian literary prize he won in 1957.
Warum sind Sie gerade auf Kirchstetten gekommen?
Ach, das war zufällig. Ich habe irgendwo in Österreich gesucht. Früher haben wir in Italien im Sommer gewohnt. Und dann, Italien war zu teuer geworden und zu voll von Touristen. Dann, wir möchten wohnen in einem Land, wo man Wein trinkt. Wir möchten wohnen in der Nähe von einem Open House. Und dann ich persönlich habe die deutsche Sprache sehr gerne.
In 1947, the great Russian composer Igor Stravinsky asked Auden to write an opera based on engravings he'd seen of a series of paintings by the 18th century English artist William Hogarth.
This is Hogarth's series, The Rake's Progress. It's the story of a young man, Tom Rakewell, who comes into a fortune and loses it and ends up dying in Bedlam in the madhouse. I'm sure that Stravinsky found the tale an extremely powerful moral lesson, but also one filled with incident of every kind. And I think The Rake's Progress, the opera, reflects that tremendous sense of action and fast-flowing plot.
Without consulting Stravinsky, Auden decided to write the libretto with Chester Cullman, who had introduced him to opera in the first place.
Stravinsky got this idea of the Hogarth Prince. Well, then I talked to him for a bit and got certain ideas. At that point, I started to talk to Chester.
Our collaborations have been worked out on a different sort of basis. The Rake's Progress for Stravinsky was based on the Hogarth and primarily, and then an outline worked out in great detail by Mr. Auden and Mr. Stravinsky.
I think Weston was inspired. And in any case, he inspired me. Weston has been in Austria too long now. And I wish you could convince him to come back. After all, we can't afford to give our best poet to the Germans.
The first time I went to Kirchstetten, I'd been invited by Auden to stay not in the house, in the village. There was a bed and breakfast that he would put guests up in. The sitting room was where one sat around in the evening, and Auden liked the windows to be closed and the air was heavy with tobacco smoke. I can't remember what happened in the afternoon, but then there was a sort of cocktail hour and then supper. The kitchen was sort of Chester's domain, rather. He was always very kind to me. He often gets a bad press, but you have to think that it wouldn't have been that easy to be the love of Auden's life. That would have been difficult. But by that time, it was also well established that Chester had these boyfriends around, Greek soldiers and so on, and EFSO, and sometimes they only spoke Greek. And, it wasn't a recipe for domestic bliss.
This, I think, may be the only large plate on which a complete poem by Auden is written, and this was made for me by my daughter, Lucy, and she's illustrated it with the various images. Time will say nothing, but I told you so. Time only knows the price we have to pay. If I could tell you, I would let you know. If we should weep when clowns put on their show, if we should stumble when musicians play, time will say nothing, but I told you so. The winds must come from somewhere when they blow. There must be reasons why the leaves decay. Time will say nothing, but I told you so. Perhaps the roses really want to grow. The vision seriously intends to stay. If I could tell you, I would let you know. Suppose the lions all get up and go, and all the brooks and soldiers run away. Will time say nothing, but I told you so? If I could tell you, I would let you know. He mentions lions there. He says, suppose the lions all get up and go. I once looked through Auden's work to see how often lions occurred, and there are a lot of lions. I don't know whether Auden ever saw a lion or ever met a lion, but the lions are there.
This was Auden's car. When he lived in Austria, he used this car. It's very old. It might have been bought in the 1960s, I think. And since then, it has been in storerooms and it is waiting to be repaired. He drove for several years, but then he had an accident and he asked his housekeeper to get a driving license. He bought her the driving license, and after that, she always had to drive him everywhere he wanted to go. He didn't drive anymore.
Auden lived very much a chemical life. It was uppers and downers. And working with the windows shut and the curtains drawn, sort of to do with being on a kind of benzodrine high. And then the cocktails are the downers. Somebody who lives that kind of life is saving up for a huge depression towards the end. And that's what was so sad about his fetching up in Oxford.
In 1972, Auden left New York to live in Oxford, in a cottage in the grounds of his old college, Christ Church.
He'd come back thinking to have a nice, genteel retirement in Oxford and found that he hated it, which is understandable because he was getting on and he was repetitive and laid down the law. And the dons at Christchurch, where they'd given him rooms in a cottage in the grounds, they found him extremely irritating every night, to have him saying the same things again and again. And I think only the more open-minded younger dons could understand what his celebrity amounted to. The others just shrugged him off, really, and found him an irritant.
If you ask what the function of writing is, I would first say what Dr. Johnson said. The aim of writing is to enable readers a little better to enjoy life or a little better to endure it.
Yes.
And then the arts are a chief means of communication with the dead. And I personally think that without communication with the dead, a fully human life is not possible.
Auden still spent his summers in Kestetten, and on the evening of September the 28th, 1973, he gave a poetry reading in Vienna for members of the Austrian Society of Literature. No one in the audience that evening could have known that this was to be his final public appearance.
I'll just finish with two Clary Hughes. The Geheimrat in Goethe made him all the curter with Leute who were leery of his colour theory. When the young Kant was told to kiss his aunt, he obeyed the categorical must, but only just.
I'd asked him whether he would like to come and stay in my flat in Vienna or do anything of the kind, and he said no. He preferred to go to the hotel because he'd go straight to bed after his reading at the Society of Literature. And he was perfectly all right then, you see, and he went back to the hotel and died in the night.
I saw it in the newspaper when I was just leaving for Vietnam. I thought the great man had gone. Somebody said about somebody completely different who died recently, hearing the news was like hearing there are no more polar bears.
Follow, poet, follow right to the bottom of the night. With your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise.
I've learned so much from this poet. I've been transported by his words. My life has been enriched by his language. I've stopped and thought, over so many of his lines. He can be with us in every part of our lives, showing us how rich life can be and how precious. For that, I'm more grateful to him than I can ever say.
W.H. Auden made life better for me, and that's the driver for you creating anything, is to kind of, is to make your life better, give you peace. So he changed my life profoundly.
The great work of art is built to last, and we go back to it, and each time we go back to it, we see something we simply did not see before. It's one of the reasons why he survived when so many others have actually fallen by the wayside.
Auden falls on the right side of modern, which seems to have actually lasted through a century. He seems to be on the right side of history. Then, of course, you would expect him to be ahead of his time, because that's what poets often are.
The glacier knocks in the cupboard, the desert sighs in the bed, and a crack in the teacup opens, a lane to the land of the dead, where the beggars raffle the banknotes, and the giant is enchanting to Jack, and the lily-white boy is Aurora, and Jill goes down on her back. Oh, look, look in the mirror, oh, look in your distress. Life remains a blessing, although you cannot bless. Oh, stand, stand at the window as the tears scald and start. You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart. It was late, late in the evening. The lovers, they were gone. The clocks had ceased their chiming, and the deep river ran on.